Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is Hannah Hosking, Senior Manager of Meetings and Events here at SEIA, and thank you for joining today's webinar, The Solar Industry's Commitment to an Ethical Supply Chain, New Tools and Resources. The Solar Energy Industries Association is leading the transformation to a clean energy economy, creating the framework for solar to achieve 20% of U.S. electricity generation by 2030. SEIA works with its 1,000 member companies and other strategic partners to fight for policies that create jobs in every community and shape fair market rules that promote competition and the growth of reliable, low-cost solar power. Founded in 1974, SEIA is a national trade association building a comprehensive vision for the Solar Plus decade through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for your continued support. If you have any questions or needs, please contact the SEIA membership team by emailing membership@seia.org. Please note that all listeners will be muted during this call. However, participants may submit questions for a Q&A session following the presentation. For the Q&A portion of this webinar, you may type your question to the panelists into the chat box located within the black navigation bar on your screen at any time. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Please note this webinar is open to press. After this webinar, participants can expect to receive a copy of the recording and a link to today's presentation in a follow-up email in the coming days. I'll now pass it off to Abby Hopper, SEIA's President and CEO, to begin today's webinar. Abby?
Great, Hannah, thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on where in the world you are. Our panelists are certainly representing all of those time zones, and we're so very glad that you could join us today for this incredibly important discussion. Last fall, I'm personally coming to you live from K Street here in Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful spring day. And we're just really glad to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about and why. Last fall, it became clear to us that the solar industry really needed some new resources to help promote an ethical supply chain, including forced labor prevention. We've been hard at work over the past few months, and I'm excited to tell you about 3 new resources that we released yesterday: the Solar Commitment to Environmental and Social Responsibility, a Traceability Protocol, and a Buyer's Guide. And you'll hear more about all of those. And we did this for 3 reasons. These tools are designed to promote ethical and sustainable procurement of solar products, to provide assurances that solar products are free of forced labor, and to assess supply chain risk through transparency. So the Solar Commitment, which my colleague Evelyn Butler will talk about in a moment, is a corporate social responsibility code of conduct that recognizes the need for companies to increasingly take responsibility for every aspect of their solar supply chain, from upstream materials to recycling and disposition. In contrast, the Solar Supply Chain Traceability Protocol, which John and his colleagues will talk about, is a set of industry guidelines designed to help solar companies meet important import compliance obligations, and importantly, provide customers with assurances that their solar products are free of unethical labor practices. Before I turn this over to Evelyn, though, I just want to take a moment and thank everyone who's on this call today: Evelyn Butler, John Smirnow, Andy Klump, and Frederick Dross. They have been working literally for months to put these products together with many, many of you. So with no further ado, Evelyn, I will hand it over to you to walk through the Solar Commitment.
Great, thank you, Abby, and welcome everyone. So just to cover a few things before we get into some of the topics that are covered, SEIA has had engagement in terms of corporate social responsibility for quite some time. In fact, the Solar Commitment was a program that was developed many years ago at the behest of our board, and again, the desire for there to be a much more enhanced awareness about the fact that, you know, as private citizens, but also as corporate citizens, we have a responsibility to our environment and to the globe and to all of our workers, et cetera. And so what we decided to do last year was to revisit that original commitment and to understand that, you know, the world was changing pretty rapidly around us. And there were other organizations as well, such as the Responsible Business Alliance, which comprises of a lot of members in the electronics industry, as well as other industries, retailers, et cetera, that were really taking much more broader steps and making broader statements about their commitment to environmental and social responsibility. And we felt it was only natural for us as well to do the same. And so we did convene many of our members to participate in this. We actually started, as Abby said, back in September-ish timeframe. We've been working on it for quite some time. We did use a lot of the provisions in the RBA's Code of Conduct, actually 6.0 to begin with, because at that time that was the current version, and since January they've actually released their 7.0 version, and we did also take a brief look at that as well to make sure that we were aligned with some of their ethics concerns there. And what we really are doing is defining those common practices as well as considerations and expectations of how we do our business across the supply chain and with respect to our employees and the impact that our equipment has on consumers and industries and others. And so, as a very practical matter, participants who sign on to the solar commitment will be committing to, continuous improvement. Obviously, there's, it's one thing to expect compliance of the entire thing as a whole, all at one go, but we realize it's a work in progress for a lot of organizations in order for them to improve how they do business and do that responsibly. They also need to identify some key performance indicators, which we do track, and we do ask them to report on within a year of signing on. And then if there are any corrective actions or concerns that we might have with their current business practices, that we address those as well. Next slide, Hannah. So I'm just going to cover really quickly some of the areas. And obviously, if you download the document from our website, you'll see much more detail that is covered here. And in addition to what we found to be very valuable coming from the Responsible Business Alliance's Code of Conduct, there were additional areas that we felt really necessary to add on that were specific to our industry and are just intentional in terms of our overall perspectives on what we need to address from a social and equity perspective. So core areas like diversity, equity, inclusivity, and justice, obviously top of mind for us as an industry in terms of our drive to become more diverse and inclusive. We also, from a labor and workforce perspective, what are the considerations and ideal behaviors that we would like to see our members and industry exhibit? Core health and safety concerns, obviously environmental responsibility, which goes into, things like water management and approaches, from a conservation and efficiency perspective, management, their entire system of how they actually conduct and do their business, and then obviously some specific provisions on ethics. But there are also some very solar-oriented areas that we wanted to cover, and one of those is human rights, and I'll allow my colleague John Schmerno will cover that in much more detail. But that essentially, the provisions on that do kind of dovetail into the majority of the work and a lot of the work that he and his colleagues have been working on. But there were also some very other specific things that from the last 5 or 6 years, with SEIA, we've also been approaching, in a very detailed way. So electrical and fire safety, and energy and the environment, fall protection, worker safety, clearly very important. How to report misconduct or issues with compliance, and then as a start, looking at steel sourcing and what recommendations we might have there. Next slide, Hannah. So we do find that there will be some very specific benefits for our industry in terms of complying and signing on to the solar commitment. Obviously the perspectives coming from the general public, from our stakeholders, from government, et cetera, we're really keen on providing the platform for which they can experience some enhanced credibility, as well as look inward and increase their efficiency and innovation, and then also demonstrate leadership and sustainability, which we feel is paramount for our industry, given the core of what we do. And then last but not least, there are thousands of companies in our industry today, and we really feel it is important that there is a growing embracement of corporate social responsibility, given our mission as well. So next slide, Hannah. So last of all, in terms of what can you do next in order to participate in the solar commitment and sign on to it, we invite companies to do so, as well as those participants who decide to sign on to share the commitment with their suppliers. We do have a letter that's available on our website that you can download and identify those areas to which you'll be focusing on or which you feel like you're already in compliance with. You can send that letter to me. My email's on our website as well. And our next steps is we are looking very clearly into identifying and qualifying service partners, as well as additional tools that can assist companies with compliance as you're on your journey towards building out and complying with all of the different areas that we've identified. And then we also are planning on translating the commitment into additional language. We're going to start with Mandarin. We're also open to feedback on other languages from folks if they feel from their supplier perspective that there are other priority languages they'd like to see the commitment in order to share it. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague John. And I see some questions popping up in the chat already, so I'm sure we'll get to those towards the end. So take it away, John.
Great, thank you, Evelyn. And Evelyn's going to also join us for the Q&A a little bit later. Evelyn, I think the timing's good for this question. Which companies are invited to sign on? Like who can join the solar commitment? You're muted.
Whoops, sorry about that. There are no restrictions on the companies that are interested in signing on to the solar commitment. Clearly we would very much like our members as well to be very keen on doing that, but we would also, welcome others who are interested in making that commitment as well.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. And we'll bring you back in at the Q&A probably around 1:45, 15 minutes before the hour. So thanks.
That's great.
So yeah, I'm also coming to you from SEIA headquarters here in DC. It's good to be back in the office. Things are starting to loosen up here in DC. I know that's not the case for everyone, and our thoughts and prayers go out to our colleagues in India and Brazil. We actually had a colleague in Brazil who's coming back. But yeah, I know the stress and pain and hardship of COVID is far from over for many of us, and just want our colleagues around the world to know that we're thinking about them. Okay, so what is the Supply Chain Traceability Protocol? It's a first stage document that really is designed to trace material inputs throughout the various production processes. I'll have a slide later that shows an example of the solar module supply chain. But why are we doing this? A couple of reasons. One, both the US government and customers increasingly want to know goods that are being imported into the US, where are those goods being manufactured? It really is the heart of that, is to be able to trace these key material inputs throughout the supply chain. A couple of reasons. One, there are regional issues that are tied to forced labor. We've seen that in China. We see that in other regions of the world. If you think of conflict minerals, cobalt, the Democratic Republic of Congo, companies, governments want to know where key inputs are being imported from, and having a transparent system where the manufacturers have a credible system subject to due diligence provides those assurances. And the industry is already doing a lot of this. I think I'll speak to some of the natural attributes of traceability in the solar supply chain, but we think that there's a need for this additional overlay. Next slide, please, Hannah. One thing I want to make clear is this is an early stage guidance document. We've been working on it for several months. We think eventually it is something that could become an industry standard, but at this stage of its development, it's a guidance document. We want to get it into the field, have companies start to adopt it, implement it, and then over time, we expect that it will be refined. We're actually going to revisit the document in 6 months after companies have had the opportunity to integrate it into their systems. So what are the key elements of the protocol? The main focus is transparency across the solar supply chain. The other two key elements are integrating this transparency into management systems. And so as folks will see in the document, having management sign off, buy-in, leadership, the leadership of a company saying this is important to them is critically important. And then bringing this transparency throughout your operational processes. And then due diligence is, as I said, is a really important element of this. And we look at due diligence in this context, most importantly as independent audits, third-party independent audits. With respect to some of the concerns we're seeing in the Xinjiang region, that really is our primary concern, is that you don't have, as far as we understand, you don't have the ability for independent third-party audits there. So there is no transparency into the supply chain there, and that creates unreasonable risks for consumers of solar energy. I also want to highlight SEIA, Clean Energy Associates, Synergy Trade Services have been our partners in this project. They are quality assurance auditors that have deep expertise in the solar supply chain. But the traceability protocol is designed to be implemented by any company, but then audited by any credible third-party auditor as well. And so this isn't just about CEA and STS. For example, PI Berlin, I know they've been working on some traceability stuff. And what we're doing is we're putting forward the key, what we think on behalf of the industry, and bringing together the leadership of the industry, the key principles for tracing products, material inputs throughout your supply chain. Next slide, please. So I've referred to this, forced labor concerns in the solar supply chain. You've seen the several New York Times stories, just a variety of reporting on this. Bloomberg, most recently, Michael Copley's put out a couple stories about concerns of solar being in Xinjiang and potentially allegations that there are forced labor concerns there. Here in the United States, we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would create a rebuttable presumption that any good being imported into the US, if it includes materials from the region, that there's an assumption that it's linked to forced labor. Under that scenario of a rebuttable presumption, the burden then shifts to the importer to establish by clear and convincing evidence that there is no forced labor in their supply chain. It's a very high standard, clear and convincing evidence, and it requires an independent third-party audit. So if you're not able to get a third-party audit, US Customs, if this rebuttable presumption comes into place, you're not going to be able to import your products into the US. And again, that's just a risk profile that is unacceptable from the industry's perspective. And certainly we're hearing about potential enforcement action on polysilicon from Xinjiang. We don't have specifics on that. I'm just referring to what is circulating out in the press. But we've seen the US government take significant enforcement measures against cotton, tomato products. And certainly we think that solar has a very high risk profile in that context. And customers want assurances that the products they're purchasing do not include forced labor, or that their manufacturers are taking steps to prevent forced labor, and transparency is a necessary key element of that. Next slide, please. So I talked briefly about this. This is the unique attributes of solar module traceability. And I want to spend a little bit of time in the slide because it's important. In the cotton industry, I'm not a cotton expert, but my understanding of talking to folks who are is that it's quite difficult actually to trace cotton through the supply chain. Grown in the field, goes into the farmer's warehouse, and then goes into a local township warehouse, and then a regional warehouse. Lots of commingling, becomes gets sold and turned into thread and cloth, and variety of different operations, comes back and is assembled into a finished good. So many different exchanges, lots of commingling, blending. So really quite difficult, my understanding, is to trace cotton through the supply chain. The solar industry is different though, and here's why. The first thing is the output of the solar cell, the efficiency of the solar cell, is directly tied to the quality of the polysilicon and the type of ingot that is produced from that polysilicon. And so companies need to know the chemistry of the polysilicon that is going into the supply chain. There's also blending instances where a company will blend a higher purity polysilicon with a mid-grade purity polysilicon, specific formulas for that. And so when you're talking about having to understand purity levels, chemistry, you need to know those attributes of the product, and that you need to know where it's made, you need to know who made it. And so that then transfers to the ingot process, the wafer process, and the cell efficiency. The other second element of traceability aspect of solar is quality assurance. And so we've seen a quality assurance audit industry build up around the solar industry globally. Investors developers are investing literally billions of dollars. This year, the US solar market will probably be a $20 billion market. So investing billions of dollars in long-term assets, and solar module is the key piece of equipment that goes into a solar power station. And if you're going to put $100 million in, you want some assurances that those panels are going to last for 20, 25, 30 years, because your whole business model is based around that. And so companies hire auditors to go to module factories around the world, pull a module off the assembly line, take it to a back room, a lab, break it down, test it, check its quality output, look at the bill of materials, understand where the different goods are coming from. Have there been a lot of changes in suppliers, for example? They want to know about suppliers, they're good suppliers or not so good suppliers. And so companies like SEIA and STS conduct those quality assurance audits. And so they understand the processes and are already doing some of this traceability. And then the third element, for the last 10 years, the US solar industry has been subject to a variety of trade remedy measures, whether we're talking about anti-dumping or countervailing duties, the Section 201 tariffs, and the country of origin of inputs into those products is important. It determines the country of origin of the imported module, for example, the cell. And US Customs has for many years considered solar a trade enforcement priority, particularly with respect to anti-dumping and countervailing duty. And so, most of the major suppliers have had to field very extensive inquiries from US Customs. Where did your cells come from? Where did your wafers come from? Show me. Provide the type of documentation that Customs traditionally requires in country of origin determinations. And so, if you look at all three of those, you think of all three of those, it's pretty easy to see that tracing within the solar industry is achievable. I think it's not a question of whether we can trace or not. It's really comes down to a question of, are companies willing to provide the information to contribute where necessary to make sure that the necessary tracing information moves through the solar supply chain. Next slide, please, Anna. We also are including a solar buyer's guide on traceability, a few-page document. The idea there is to give buyers a high-level overview of what the protocol is intended to do, the role of the manufacturers in implementing it, the role of the buyers, and then we ask a few key questions for suppliers, which can be tough questions for some manufacturers to answer. And so that's the third piece of collateral that we released yesterday. Okay, so that was a very quick, fast run through. What I'd like to do now is turn to Andy Klump, Frederick Dross. We're going to have a roundtable discussion. Before we do that, I have to shout out the other folks who really helped with this. Alec Manuzzo, president of STS, was involved. Thibault Lemon with STS, huge commitment. And Paul Wormser, Mike Scott from SEIA. And certainly Amir Yazdi, my assistant general counsel, who keeps me out of trouble, has made a massive contribution to this product, as well as our international trade intern, Hayani Santana. So Frederic and Andy, if you guys are ready, let's have a discussion.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks, John.
Great. And I have to point out this is an old technology solar panel, Evergreen. Some folks remember Evergreen Technology, and they used what was called string ribbon technology, basically a kerfless wafer production process. A lot of historical solar modules here around SEIA. Okay, Andy. So let's talk about audits in the solar supply chain. I want to start with you. As an auditor, what are some of the challenges you face in conducting audits in the solar supply chain around the world? I'm not limiting that to just one country.
Absolutely. So, I mean, just to answer that question, be on the same page, I think we all know we're here because renewable energy is really the key element to get to a carbon neutral future. So solar is an essential part of this mix. So once again, it's great to be working with yourself, John, and the rest of the group here. But look, as an auditor, one of our big challenges has been, and this isn't just in China, it's just really globally, is making sure to coordinate well with suppliers, and to coordinate with them involves getting their approval to look at facilities. And I think one of the things that's a little unique in this case, and once again, we have a team that's in 13 countries globally. We have 115 engineers and inspectors. We're typically going into the facility, and it's directly the buyer who's contracting that entity. I think in this case, we're now seeing module buyers have to coordinate with their upstream partners. So it's really the module company that's either integrated into the upstream cells and wafers and ingot producers, and they're actually going to a polysilicon facility. So there's an extra layer that's involved. In some cases, the cell and module manufacturers have to work with a wafer supplier who then works with a polysilicon supplier. So it's just an extra step or two that's required. But once again, I'd just like to highlight, advanced preparation is really key, and that's one of the values of this protocol, is that everyone's on the same page and working towards the same goal, because we know we all need more solar energy. So I think those are some of the core challenges that we're going to see and we've experienced in the past.
Thanks, Andy. Frederic, you heard me talk about the concerns of independent third-party audits, or the absence of them in Xinjiang. So, setting that aside, for other regions outside, as an auditor, are you able to conduct independent audits in areas outside of that region, in China?
So yeah, the answer is yes. We are able. We have actually conducted already a handful of these supply chain audits, and generally speaking, we are able. We have actually something like 20 developers who are contracted us already to do that. We have 30 more audits which are planned, something like that. And typically, yes, we are able to conduct these audits. It's important to note, though, that we're not conducting social responsibility audits. What we have conducted is our technical audits. We're talking about transparency. I think you mentioned that. We're talking about traceability. We're actually also talking about security of the supply chain and risk management. These are the topics that we are talking about, not so much social responsibility. So I could not really answer the question on that, I have to say. But an audit is typically it's a quantitative assessment of the risk. So what you get is you get a list of findings. So the things that you expect to change. You actually get also opportunities for improvement. But what you also get as an outcome of an audit are what we call strong points. So this is also an opportunity for the manufacturers to shine. In fact, to say, look, we are ready. We have this in place. So in general, we see again a good cooperation. It happens from time to time, but that is not linked to the topic that the manufacturer may push back, sometimes refuse part of the audits. Sometimes I actually try to influence the developer in the auditor, in who's going to be the auditor that we are facing. But I don't think this is so. First, this is a red flag for our customers, but also I don't think it's linked specifically to this particular topic.
Yep. Yeah, and I wanted to highlight that because the independent third-party audit is such an important part of the protocol. And Andy, could you just speak to that? I mean, the value of the traceability protocol. It's one thing to say you're doing this, but we think due diligence and auditing is an essential element. Could you just talk to the importance of auditing?
Absolutely. One can't just rely on a paper trail alone. Once again, many suppliers, in my experience, having lived and worked in China for the last 18 years and being involved in solar for the last 15, I saw what it was like inside Trina Solar from 2006 to 2008 when I was there working in Changzhou. But the reality is one absolutely needs to have an in-person independent third party doing this work at the time that one's products are actually being manufactured. So having the system in place is clear. All the major manufacturers are embracing what are standard processes and systems to trace all their upstream components. They all have manufacturing execution systems in place. And so we're asking for some additional work towards the product that's actually being manufactured. And it's important to have that independent third party there. In addition to that, we also do engage with quality, environment, and health and safety audits. And that's, this is a key part of this process. So I think the largest manufacturers are very accustomed to this. And so they've worked with leading inspectors and responded to the inquiries. So once again, corporate buyers and developers of solar assets are absolutely in control. They can ask for this and input these into their RFPs and their supplier contracts. So we're certainly very familiar with this process.
Great, thank you. And that's a good transition. So two buyers. Frederic, solar buyers have a lot of questions for us about the protocol, mainly focused on how should they utilize the document. Can you just give us a high-level overview of what's the solar buyer's role in the implementation process? I think Andy touched a bit on that, but you could walk through that a bit more.
Sure. So our customers, the buyers, they what they say is trust but verify. So they usually that's their mindset. They want to build a good partnership, a good relationship with their suppliers, but they also need to verify. And I think for that, the audits is a key tool. In fact, an audit is always in two phases. The first part is on self-declaration. So we are capturing the self-declaration of the supplier, but there's always a second part, which is collection of evidence. And it's important to understand that the risk that an audit is a evidence-based risk assessment. So typically, if I want to take an example here, what we're asking, in the audits that we've done already, typically we make a mapping of the supply chain, and then we ask the auditee whether they are able to trace, and then trace the origin of the cells, trace the origin of the wafers. Do they go beyond that? And then if they say, yeah, we're able to do that, then we look into the MES records. We also look at the POs. Usually just looking at the data is not enough. We look at the traces that we can find, level of inventories, for instance, things like that, because the reliability of the information is is a key question here. And for that, I think the qualification and the training of the auditor is quite important. I want to go back just a little bit to the due diligence part. There is actually in the protocol an annex C, which is guidance on due diligence. Okay, this is definitely a tool for independent, accredited inspectors, but it's also actually a tool for the manufacturers. So there's a general principle of improvement of processes, which is called PDCA, Plan, Do, Control, Act, and the C, the control part, is actually monitoring of your processes. You cannot improve if you don't monitor, and this part of monitoring, manufacturers can use the due diligence part, which is in this protocol for that.
Okay, great. Andy, one aspect of the protocol, I mean, we are not intending that every supplier go to their, every purchaser go to their supplier and say, hey, I need you to do, hire SEIA to do an audit for me. That's certainly not the intention. We think that, most of the time the manufacturers are going to conduct an audit and share that with the supplier, and that's going to be sufficient, credible, and we think that certainly there will be companies that are going to want to have their own, like the quality assurance space, their own methodology, not methodology, but their own review. In talking about an audit report that's being provided by a manufacturer, what are some of the things that a supplier should be looking for to assess the credibility of that document?
Yeah, so obviously, adherence to the protocol that adherence to the system they have in place. Once again, we talked about the MES documentation is certainly a piece of that. But once again, showing that long-term commitment to using MES, being able to have a traceability program that's been used in the past, and all manufacturers have certainly done this. But once again, I think it's important to to validate. It's once again the inspection work does need to be completed with with someone who's properly trained and has seen and witnessed many different environments in the industry. And so I think it is important to look at what the manufacturers have. All manufacturers do have their own internal inspection and quality control teams, but I think there also is a great deal of value. Once again, to having an independent third-party auditor who actually has gone through extensive external training on international standards. It's one of the things that we've done at SEIA for the last 5 years is follow a very thorough Foreign Corrupt Practices Act training, and that's one of the reasons we get very involved, is making sure to have that independence. But you're right. I think buyers have a choice to look at those records and validate them, either on their own or with others. I will say, once again, I am living in Shanghai right now, and also say one of the challenges in the industry right now is that it is difficult to travel to China, and that's partially because of the COVID era. I think things will open up in China mid-2022, and at that point, I think more and more customers will be coming through wanting to conduct these audits, but we're very open and happy to share our knowledge information with them up until that point.
Yeah, just to clarify what I was speaking to, what wasn't a customer saying, hey, let me look at your tracing documents. It's, I think we'll see an expectation that some of the manufacturers are going to have independent third-party auditors come in, do assess the traceability, and have a valid third-party audit that they would then share with a variety of customers rather than having to do a 1-1-1 type thing. That was more of what I was referring to. But yeah, I think you got most of that. Thank you. I want to pivot now to manufacturers and Frederic. So what do you see? I think actually no, we already talked about this. What do you see as some of the challenges? But for someone who is new to implementing traceability or some type of a traceability protocol, what do you think some of their first steps should be? So here's a company that, we think we do a good job tracing, tracking. We have a good information technology system, but we want to do better, and we want to align our systems with what SEIA's guidance document. Where do they start?
Yeah. So the traceability protocol has been designed from the beginning. The structure has been designed to follow the structure of ISO 9001, which is probably the most common quality standard, international quality standard, and that's by design. Really, that is really by design. What we wanted to have is a tool which is easy to implement, easy to audit, and that starts. And if you look at the standards, it starts with leadership. So one of the must-have is leadership commitment. That is something which is actually very important, we believe. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing that you have, if you follow the same structure, is robust processes. It's very important to have very robust processes, to have give confidence to the rest of the stakeholders that you are capable of tracing these components through the entire value chain. And honestly, this is already in ISO 9001 section, I think 8.5.2 is identification traceability. That is the type of things that we are talking about. There's also a section on the risk level. These are the things which matter for that. So I would say, don't panic. What we are looking at is something that is already very clearly documented in international standards.
Great, thank you. So I think we have so many questions, and there's so many good questions. So let's start getting into some of the questions here.
And John, I'm happy to. I just want to add just one other point.
Sure, yeah, go right ahead. That gives me time to comb through these.
Sure. So look, I think it's extremely important for everyone in the industry to know. Once again, polysilicon manufacturing is not a simple, straightforward, easy process. Once again, I've been involved in the industry in China in solar for 15 years, and one of my roles was to sign up Trina's long-term polysilicon agreements. And so I went, negotiated with over 100 plus suppliers, and I saw firsthand by visiting polysilicon facilities in 3 different continents, certainly including China. These are highly automated facilities with highly skilled labor. So these are massive petrochemical facilities. So it is not easy to create a polysilicon facility. And but once again, we're seeing the industry grow in scale that we've never seen before. And this, there is important just to comprehend. There's already 3 times the amount of polysilicon outside of the province of Xinjiang that can meet the entire needs of the U.S. solar industry. So once again, we're in a very, very strong situation where we can go through an audit and validate the product's provenance, and I think the industry should know that. And on top of this, we're seeing the industry grow from over 550,000 metric tons to 900,000 metric tons by 2022. So there's a tremendous amount of capacity that's coming on, once again, outside of Xinjiang in provinces such as Sichuan, Inner Mongolia, and Yunnan. So I think it's also important just to recognize in the context of what we're talking about, there absolutely is a solution. So all buyers of solar products with using this protocol have a real clear control over their procurement decisions. So, but John, please go ahead. I know there are a lot.
And if I can add to that, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can add to that, I think it is true that there is more polysilicon coming online. There is already a lot of polysilicon outside of Xinjiang. However, there are many other parts of the world which will likely require the same. It's a question of buyer requirements. And to be honest, it's a new buyer requirements. There were requirements for some traceability, but never to this level. So this is something new, and that's what we see when we do the audits. That the questions are new to them. It takes time. Sometimes we see that the audit preparation takes a longer time. We see that sometimes it takes time for the team to gather the evidence that we're looking for. So I think time is a very important factor. The solution is there, but we have to get to there, and it's going to take some time, and we need to acknowledge that and make sure that we have a smooth transition.
Andy, what are you seeing in uptake? So how are the manufacturers responding? We just released this, but as you know, most of the major manufacturers, anybody who was paying attention in the fall, started working on traceability in parallel with this. Most of the major suppliers. I think that's important for folks to realize that this isn't, we're releasing this document yesterday and then companies now have to rush to implement it. We've been working with a lot of the major module suppliers about this, some of the leading developers, purchasers in parallel, and that actually helped us design a program where that they're already working with. But what are you seeing of people uptake on traceability, whether this protocol or some related traceability protocol?
So certainly manufacturers have been observing and watching the industry grow and evolve, and this has been a hot topic in recent months. But you're absolutely right. I mean, since talking with a lot of C-level executives myself, who I've known for the last 10 to 15 years throughout the industry, many have been aware of that among the major manufacturers. I think the larger, well-established companies are much further ahead. And once again, many of these companies have had a manufacturing execution system in place for over a decade. So they're very well aware of this. But once again, to Frederick's point, this does take time to actually go through and integrate. There's also some broader, I'd say, political factors that are in place that make it a little bit challenging for some of them to go and just implement this immediately. It does require cooperation from their upstream partners. And once again, the reality is the polysilicon part of the supply chain is very different. These are massive petrochemical facilities. Well-capitalized companies are going after this sector and expanding very rapidly. But these are often not the core module manufacturers themselves. So there's a joint cooperation. And so it will take a little bit of time to get this, even though many have been preparing for many months, if not several quarters.
Yeah, we definitely need companies, for this to be effective. Companies across the supply chain have to be willing and supportive. There was a question I just want to clarify. It was suggested that manufacturing audits are sufficient. That wasn't my point. My point was, if a manufacturer hires someone, like SEIA, STS to do a traceability audit, independent third party, and then provides that to their buyers, that could be sufficient. That's going to be the buyer that's going to have to make a decision on that. But if I was a buyer and somebody gave me CEA's report of their facility, their operations, STS, I would find that to be credible.
If I can add to that,
yeah, go ahead,
John, if you want.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, I think, to look at what you're going to get from these audits as a buyer. First, what you're going to get is an audit score, and typically for this type of audits, it's a risk level. So this is typically used in an assessment phase where you're assessing your suppliers, and typically this risk level is, for this case, it's like an indicator of how capable the supplier is at identifying sources and provenance of components and materials, because that's the definition of traceability. And then, maybe we want to add a little bit more than traceability to make everybody comfortable. Like I still do think that security is important. I still do think that risk management is important, and it's maybe the object of version 2 of this protocol. I don't know, but okay, that is something. And then you have the list of findings, and the list of findings are also very actionable for a buyer, because you can adapt, discuss contractual obligations when you have this list of findings, and we see that typically when our customers receive this list of findings, they will ask for CAPA, corrective action and preventive actions, and that's what they're gonna have to enforce implementation before manufacturing starts. And so the results that we get from these audits are very actionable.
Okay, so there a few as you can imagine, there's some sensitive questions here as well. I'm going to take a few of these, just yeah, because that's what we do. One question: why is SEIA not leveraging EPEAT? And EPEAT is an environmental standard, something that exists. I know that there are a couple, a coalition of U.S. companies that are working with EPEAT on a solar module standard tied to carbon output. The protocol is actually a good framework if you want to track carbon, how much carbon is in the raw materials that are used to develop a module, which gives you what's called a life cycle assessment. So yeah, I mean, sure, we absolutely are going to look to work with other organizations. The Responsible Business Alliance, we have an ongoing discussion with them. So there are other standards bodies. Someone had asked, why aren't you just relying on this industry, this longer, an international standard? A lot of the existing standards were taken into consideration when we developed this. But Evelyn, do you want to speak a bit more about as we go forward with both the solar commitment and the traceability protocol and the opportunities to collaborate with some of the other existing standards bodies, social audit type folks?
Yeah, absolutely, and good lead in to that, John. So as I mentioned during the presentation, we are definitely our next steps include looking into providing different options available to our members as well as to industry in order to have some flexibility and to find a partner that works best with them. Certainly, EPEAT and the NSF standard is one option as well. It's something that we've also written about in the past, encouraging our manufacturers to look into, how that might work into their business plans and their business, how they run their business. And we're certainly part of that conversation as the standard was being written, as well as expanded to include inverters. So it's definitely a viable option, but we would like to explore what are all the different possibilities in terms of service partners and tools to assist companies with compliance. So that's definitely our next step.
Great, thanks. A couple questions about polysilicon sourcing outside of the region. About half of global polysilicon in the region, but that means the other half isn't. There are supplies out in China, Europe supplies polysilicon, U.S. certainly. I know the U.S. is actually in a tough spot because U.S. polysilicon manufacturers have been, in my opinion, been treated quite unfairly with respect to selling into China, been unnecessarily blocked from competing in the China market. But certainly, as we as an industry want to grow solar supply chain, SEIA is doing a lot of work on manufacturing. Just came from a call earlier today with key Ways and Means staff about specific manufacturing incentives that would help grow the solar supply chain in the U.S. We have 4 existing U.S. polysilicon facilities, and we're going to do what we can to help make sure that those plants stay around and thrive into the future. So applying the protocol to other products, someone asked, is the protocol applicable to CadTel or gallium chemistries? Andy?
Yeah. So, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So
yeah, I think Andy's up for a response.
So one thing,
we got a couple alpha males I'm managing here. So go ahead.
Frederick, you can please go right ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Andy. Go ahead. My pleasure.
So look at once again for those who are familiar with CadTel products manufactured by First Solar. Once again, note that these are not manufactured in China. First Solar does have factories in the U.S. as well as Vietnam, Malaysia. Our teams have been there for many years. So there are separate audits that can be applied there. But once again, this is focused on the crystalline supply chain. And I know the question was raised about, okay, what about ingots or wafers? Once again, if you trace the product, as John showed in the supply chain. Once again, you start with the module and then go upstream to cells, wafers, ingots, and then polysilicon. Once again, all facets of the crystalline solar supply chain can be audited, and this would be applied. So I think the whole protocol is really geared towards that. So we've had PhDs in our team with experience in all these areas, so we're certainly well equipped to handle this. That should not be an issue.
Okay, I have a question for Evelyn, but before I get to you, Evelyn, the idea of this protocol, being developed into covering other products, energy storage products or inverters, and we definitely designed it with that in mind. You see, we have an as a annex, solar specific, solar module specific, but the intent was that this document would grow, and over time you could add other products to it. Evelyn, one of the concerns, and I hear this during our meetings with the administration, with members of Congress, is that there's a lot of concern with China's forced labor transfer program beyond the region. The protocol doesn't get into that. We're not asking people to audit about forced labor, but the commitment would. The commitment does, and so talk to how the importance of having, and we recognize in the protocol that it's so important to have a good, strong corporate social responsibility code of conduct or commitment. If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a very distinct section in terms of labor expectations and some of the tenets around upholding the human rights of workers. And again, from an international perspective, it's not necessarily focused on one specific country or another, or has provisions that are exemplary for one country or another. But in essence, we have some very specific statements about, the fact that we don't condone the use of forced bonded or indentured labor, or exploitative prison labor, slavery, trafficking of persons, that, there must be, retention of the freedom of movement and the voluntary status of employment. We use very specifically the words employee's own work volition, which essentially means that there is a free decision about coming into the employment for a specific job, and that they're also free to leave that work at any time or terminate their employment. Also tied to that are other provisions about disciplinary action and, what can be done, what can't be done, as far as, again, retaining those basic, human rights to make decisions about where you're working, how you've come into that work. There's also provisions about being able to understand the employment situation you've come into. So written employment agreements in their native language, that contains the terms and conditions of their work hand, et cetera. So that is a pretty meaty section of the commitment. And there's also quite a bit as well that, comments on the use of child labor and compliance with young worker safety, working hours, wages, benefits, humane treatment. So we feel we're trying to address it very comprehensively. And again, with the goal in mind that, we are not, promulgating any of these situations that we've heard about happening in some of these areas.
Great, well, thank you. Okay, so that's it. We're at the end of the hour. There were so many questions. I tried to cover some of the key ones. I think people would see we weren't steering away from some of the more sensitive ones. If you have additional questions, reach out to me directly. SEIA member or not, happy to continue the conversation. Our work on this project is ongoing. We have a traceability working group that's going to continue to meet. We're going to revisit at a pretty detailed level all of this work in 6 months. And Frederic and Andy, thank you so much to the huge contribution by your teams. I really appreciate it. And Evelyn, almost single-handedly led the redo of the solar commitment. You know, and these have been months in the process, and all of our SEIA colleagues, you know, just want to thank everybody and our members for all of your support. And now I'd like to turn it over to Hannah for some closing notes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John, and thanks again for everybody participating. As a reminder, we will be sending a copy of today's presentation as well as a recording of today's presentation to all registrants early next week. So please take a look in your inbox for that. If you have any questions about the webinar itself, feel free to reach out to me by emailing events@seia.org, and hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks all.
Thanks, Hannah. Take care.